In the spring of 1962, inside a dim Hamburg apartment where the walls pulsed with shadows, Stuart Sutcliffe pressed a trembling hand against his skull as another violent surge of pain blurred the room around him. Just months earlier, he had been the beautiful ghost on stage with the young Beatles, the quiet artist whose angular stare and black-lacquered style made him shine brighter than the lights above the Reeperbahn. But behind the cool facade, something darker had been eating through him. Collapsing spells he hid from friends, sketches stained with nosebleeds, and a secret fear he whispered only to Astrid. Hollywood remembers the legends who rose. It rarely remembers the ones who vanished before the story even began. Stuart should have lived long enough to witness the world call his friends gods. Instead, he died watching his vision fade to white. This is the untold truth of Stuart Sutcliffe. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. Nam tenes. Stuart Sutcliffe's road toward the brief, brilliant spark of fame began not in a club, but inside room 14 of the Liverpool College of Art, where he spent up to 8 hours a day over charcoal, oils, and canvases nearly as tall as he was. By 1959, at just 19 years old, he had already sold one of his early expressionist works for 65 pounds. A number modest today, but at the time equivalent to nearly a full month of wages for a Liverpool laborer. It was this sale, recorded carefully in the college ledger, that Lennon bragged about for weeks, calling it proof that Stu would outpaint all of us. The turning point came in January 1960, when Lennon persuaded him to use $75 of his savings, almost everything he had, to buy a second-hand Hofner bass. Stuart agreed. Not because he dreamed of being a musician, but because he couldn't refuse Lennon's pleading mix of charm and stubborn loyalty. That moment, tiny and impulsive, became the first sin of his career, a decision made for friendship, not destiny. By August of that year, he was on stage in Hamburg, playing 6 hours a night, 7 nights a week, inside the smoky cavern of the Kaiserkeller. The schedule was punishing. Nearly 42 hours of live music weekly, double what most British acts performed in an entire month. Yet he endured it, mostly by leaning on the same discipline he used in the studio, and by hiding how little he'd slept. But even as the crowds shouted for the mysterious, brooding bassist, the deeper truth remained. Stuart had always been an artist first. Music was the detour. Lennon was the engine. And somewhere between those two forces, the fault line that would later ruin him was already beginning to tremble. Twendias. The peak of Stuart Sutcliffe's short career did not arrive with applause, but with a series of numbers that, when placed together, described a life burning too fast. By early 1961, his schedule in Hamburg had crystallized into something almost inhuman. 6 hours of performance per night, 7 nights a week, plus 20-25 hours each week studying under Eduardo Paolozzi's former peers at the Hamburg College of Art. In total, Stuart was working close to 65 to 70 hours weekly, a workload that would break most seasoned adults, let alone a 20-year-old balancing two futures at once. Yet, on the surface, this was his moment of triumph. His art instructors placed him in the top 5% of the Academy's students, praising his ability to complete full canvases in under 48 hours, something many classmates needed a week for. The Beatles, meanwhile, were drawing crowds of 300-400 people on peak nights at the Kaiserkeller, and more than once the club owner noted that a group of girls asked specifically for the quiet one with the cheekbones. His look, the sunglasses, the jet black hair cut by Astrid, the stillness, became the band's unspoken brand before the world ever heard the word Beatlemania. But the first fracture in perception appeared when critics in Hamburg noted Stuart's minimal participation in certain sets. In one particularly crowded week, records show he played just 18 of 36 sets, claiming headaches too severe to continue. The band compensated by stretching Lennon or McCartney over the bass parts. This was the beginning of Stuart's blind spot, believing he could maintain two demanding identities at once without consequence. The prophecy of collapse arrived through numbers, too. Between September and December 1961, Astrid documented 6 separate fainting spells, each lasting 2 or 5 minutes, accompanied by vision loss. Stuart dismissed them as exhaustion. Even when a professor urged him to undergo neurological testing, he skipped the appointment, the second unmistakable warning he would ignore. Meanwhile, unseen tensions inside the Beatles were quietly expanding. Paul, increasingly frustrated, logged Stuart's missed sets in a notebook. George later estimated that Stuart's musical contribution covered maybe 60 to 70% of their total Hamburg performances, a statistic that undercut the myth of him as a full-time player. Lennon, torn between loyalty and ambition, oscillated between defending him and lashing out at him, recorded in one rehearsal incident where Lennon criticized his timing in front of 12 onlookers. A humiliation Stuart never forgot. But perhaps the most telling indicator of hidden strain was the shift in his painting. Works from late 1961 show violent strokes, darker palettes, and unfinished corners, a symptom his tutors recognized. They later commented that his output, which had averaged 3 to 4 completed works per month, dropped to 1 piece in the final 2 months of his life. While the outside world saw a young man standing at the crossroads of art and rock and roll, the numbers told a different story. Reduced output, missed sets, increased collapses, and a workload spiraling beyond human limits. The peak wasn't a summit, it was a cliff, and Stuart was already standing at its edge. The collapse of Stuart Sutcliffe did not arrive suddenly. It advanced in measurable, terrifying increments. The first sign came in late 1959, when he wrote to his mother about a sharp pain behind the right eye. That pain, later identified as the earliest symptom of a congenital cerebral aneurysm, would stalk him for the next 28 months. By mid-1961, it had intensified into daily episodes lasting 30-90 minutes, forcing him to abandon rehearsals or leave classes without explanation. Astrid recorded 13 fainting spells in just 6 weeks, each marked by temporary blindness lasting up to 20 minutes. Yet Stuart refused neurological testing 3 times, insisting he was just overtired. But the hidden trauma behind these refusals stretched further back. According to his family, Stuart suffered a violent altercation at Latham Hall in January 1961 when a group of teddy boys attacked the Beatles after a show. Witnesses claimed he was kicked in the head at least twice, hard enough that he suffered 2 days of dizziness afterward. He was advised to get an X-ray, but skipped the appointment, the first major medical misstep that pushed him closer to the point of no return. As the headaches worsened, his personality began to change. Friends noticed he slept as little as 3-4 hours a night and often stayed awake sketching until dawn, working obsessively on canvases he later cut apart in frustration. His weight dropped from 60 kilos to barely 53 kilograms in 2 months, and he confessed privately to Astrid that he sometimes couldn't recognize faces when a wave of pain hit. In the classroom, he collapsed 3 separate times in front of tutors, one episode lasting long enough that they considered calling emergency services. Stuart joked it off, but his mentors recorded the incidents in academy reports, the earliest institutional documentation of his spiraling condition. Financially, his decline was equally brutal. The $50 monthly scholarship he received for his studies, nearly $1,100 in modern value, was almost entirely drained on private doctor visits by early 1962. In a letter to his mother, he admitted, "I can't afford paint this month." That sentence, buried in a page of otherwise optimistic news, revealed the brutal truth. The illness was consuming the one thing he valued most, his art. Emotionally, the situation was growing volatile. Inside the Beatles' circle, tensions escalated as Stuart's absences became more frequent. In one infamous week in February 1961, he missed 5 out of 7 scheduled sets at the Top 10 Club. Paul, who already resented having to cover bass duty, confronted him in front of George and Pete Best. George later recounted that the argument escalated to shouting, with Lennon storming out after Stuart slumped over a table in pain. The fight became the foundation for a later rumor, repeated by Pauline Sutcliffe, that Lennon had once struck Stuart during an argument. Although medical specialists have dismissed this as the cause of his aneurysm rupture, the allegation haunted the Beatles' mythology for decades. By early April 1962, the point of no return had arrived. On April 7th, Stuart collapsed in their shared home, unconscious for nearly 3 minutes. Astrid called a doctor, who urged immediate hospitalization. Stuart refused again, saying he needed to finish a painting for class. 3 days later, on April 10th, the final hemorrhage struck with catastrophic intensity. The attack began as he was preparing for an afternoon tutorial. Astrid described him screaming and clawing at his head, unable to see or stand. She dragged him onto a chair, but within 15 minutes he lost consciousness entirely. The ambulance attempted resuscitation en route, but he died shortly before arriving at Eppendorf Hospital. He was 21 years, 10 months and 3 days old. The medical report was stark: massive right ventricular cerebral hemorrhage, likely caused by a congenital aneurysm rupturing under prolonged stress. No alcohol toxicity, no external trauma. Just a weakened artery pushed past its limit by months of exhaustion, over-medication, and untreated warning signs. The devastating irony came days later when Lennon and the band, unaware of his death, arrived in Hamburg for rehearsals. Pete Best recalled that Lennon found out through Astrid's tears. Reportedly, Lennon said nothing for over 15 minutes. He simply stared at the floor. The world would come to know the Beatles as legends. Stuart would become the ghost in their early photographs, a young man who burned through 2 lifetimes of ambition in less than 22 years. His beach wasn't a dramatic fall from global fame, but something far more intimate: a brilliant, fragile artist, consumed by an illness he refused to confront, a dream he tried to split in two, and a body that collapsed long before the world understood what it had lost. In the weeks after Stuart Sutcliffe's death, a strange kind of resurrection unfolded through his work. The Hamburg College of Art held a private review of his final portfolio: 27 completed canvases, 14 charcoal studies, and 1 unfinished piece, still stained with the smudges from the day he collapsed. Palazzi's colleagues placed him in the highest tier of emerging European expressionists, estimating that several pieces could have sold for $200 or $300 each, nearly 5 times the value of his first student sale. For a moment, the career he sacrificed everything for seemed within reach. Astrid guarded his belongings with almost ritual precision. She kept his last 3 letters in a locked drawer and stored his bass in the 75 instrument that began his detour into music, in its case for more than 40 years before donating it to a museum. Lennon, who rarely admitted regret, carried Stuart's portrait in his wallet until 1967. A tiny square photograph creased at all 4 corners. Stuart's legacy rests not in what he achieved, but in what he left unfinished. A life measured in canvases, migraines, and the quiet bravery of refusing to give up the one thing that made him feel real.
This is the untold truth of Stuart Sutcliffe. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries.